The courtroom fell silent as Margaret Ellen Brooks made her way down the center aisle. Her white cane tapped rhythmically against the polished marble floor, each sound echoing through the chamber like a heartbeat. She was 78 years old, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, and her clouded eyes stared straight ahead at nothing and everything at once. At the defense table, 3 attorneys in expensive suits exchanged knowing glances. The lead counsel, Richard Harrington III, leaned toward his colleague and whispered just loud enough for the first row to hear. "This is their star witness, a blind old woman. This case is already won." His colleague, a younger attorney named Bradley Chen, smirked and adjusted his silk tie. "I almost feel bad for them, almost." But Margaret heard every word. Her hearing had become remarkably sharp over the 2 decades since she lost her sight. She heard the rustle of their expensive suits, the scratch of their Mont Blanc pens against legal pads, and the barely concealed condescension in their voices. She thought about turning around and responding, but instead she simply smiled. They would learn. They all learned eventually. Her grandson Michael guided her gently to the witness stand, his hand steady on her elbow. At 32, Michael had become her rock, her eyes, and her fiercest protector. He squeezed her arm gently before releasing her. "You got this, Grandma," he whispered. "I know, sweetheart," she replied, her voice calm and clear. "I've been waiting for this moment for 3 years." The bailiff approached. "Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" Margaret placed her weathered hand on the Bible. "I do." As she settled into the witness chair, she could feel the weight of every eye in the courtroom upon her. She could sense the skepticism radiating from the defense table, the nervous energy from the prosecution, and the curious tension from the jury box. This was the case of Morrison Development Corporation versus the residents of Willow Creek Senior Living Community, a case that had dragged on for 3 years. A case that involved fraud, deception, and the systematic exploitation of elderly residents who had trusted the wrong people with their life savings. And Margaret Ellen Brooks was about to tell her story. The plaintiff's attorney, Sarah Martinez, stood up from her table. At 45, Sarah had built her career fighting for those who couldn't fight for themselves. She had taken this case pro bono, working nights and weekends, because she believed in justice, and she believed in Margaret. "Mrs. Brooks," Sarah began, her voice warm but professional, "can you please state your full name and address for the record?" "Margaret Ellen Brooks. I resided at Willow Creek Senior Living Community, Unit 47B, from January 2019 until I was forced to leave in March 2022. "Forced to leave?" Sarah prompted. "Objection." Richard Harrington was on his feet. "Counsel is leading the witness." Judge Patricia Okonkwo, a formidable woman with 30 years on the bench, peered over her glasses. "Overruled. The witness may continue." Margaret nodded slightly toward the judge's voice. "Thank you, Your Honor. Yes, I was forced to leave. When I moved into Willow Creek, I paid a substantial entrance fee. $273,000. It was everything I had. My husband Walter and I had saved for 47 years. He passed 6 months before I moved in, and I wanted to be somewhere safe. Somewhere I could live out my remaining years with dignity." She paused, and the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. But Willow Creek was not what they promised, and Mr. Morrison's company took advantage of me and many others like me. At the defense table, Richard Harrington scribbled notes furiously. His strategy was simple: discredit the witness, make the jury doubt everything she said. After all, how could a blind woman possibly know what she claimed to know? He had no idea what he was up against. Sarah Martinez continued her direct examination. "Mrs. Brooks, can you tell us about the day you first realized something was wrong at Willow Creek?" Margaret's hands rested calmly in her lap. "It was March 15th, 2021. I remember because it was the Ides of March, and my late husband always joked about being wary on that day. I was sitting in the community room near the window where the afternoon sun came through. I could feel its warmth on my face. "What happened that afternoon?" "I heard two men enter the room. They didn't know I was there. I was sitting in the corner in the wing-back chair by the ficus tree. People often forgot I was present because I was so quiet. Because I couldn't see them, I suppose they assumed I couldn't hear them either." "Objection," Harrington rose again. "This is hearsay." "Your Honor," Sarah responded, "Mrs. Brooks is testifying to a conversation she personally witnessed. This falls under the present sense impression exception." Judge Okonkwo nodded. "I'll allow it. Continue, Mrs. Brooks." Margaret took a breath. "The two men were discussing financial matters. One of them said, and I quote, 'The old folks don't have a clue. By the time they figure out their accounts have been drained, we'll have moved the money offshore. Morrison says we need to accelerate the timeline before the quarterly audit." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. At the defense table, James Morrison himself sat frozen, his face pale beneath his artificial tan. "Did you recognize these voices, Mrs. Brooks?" "I did. The first voice belonged to Gerald Patterson, the Chief Financial Officer of Morrison Development. I had met him several times at community events. He had a distinctive way of clearing his throat every few sentences, and he always wore a cologne that smelled of sandalwood and citrus. The second voice belonged to Thomas Riley, the community manager. He had a slight Boston accent and tended to end his sentences with "you know" when he was nervous. Richard Harrington was on his feet again. "Your Honor, this witness cannot possibly identify people by voice alone. She's speculating." Margaret turned her face toward Harrington's voice. "Mr. Harrington," she said calmly, "I may have lost my sight 20 years ago, but I haven't lost my mind. When you lose one sense, the others compensate. I can identify over 200 people by their voices, their footsteps, and their personal scents. I can tell you that you're wearing Tom Ford's Oud Wood cologne, that your shoes are Italian leather with a slight squeak in the left heel, and that you had eggs for breakfast because I can smell it on your breath from here." Laughter erupted in the courtroom. Even the jury members were smiling. Judge Okonkwo banged her gavel, but there was a twinkle in her eye. "Order in the court." She turned to Harrington. "Mr. Harrington, I suggest you sit down and let the witness continue her testimony." Harrington sat, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. Bradley Chen leaned over. "She's sharper than we thought." "It doesn't matter," Harrington muttered. "We'll break her on cross." But Margaret heard that too, and she smiled again. Sarah Martinez continued, "Mrs. Brooks, what did you do after overhearing this conversation?" "At first I wasn't sure what to make of it. But that night I called my grandson Michael. He's a forensic accountant. I told him what I'd heard, and he said we needed to gather more evidence before going to the authorities." "And did you gather more evidence?" "I did. Over the following months, I became what Michael called the community's eyes and ears. Ironic, isn't it? A blind woman becoming the eyes of an investigation." She paused, and her voice grew stronger. "I started paying attention to everything. I noted every conversation, every unusual sound, every pattern of behavior. I kept a voice journal, recording my observations every night. I documented when Morrison's executives visited, what times the financial office was open late, and which residents were being pressured to sign new documents." "Objection!" Harrington was up again. "Your Honor, the witness is not qualified to interpret business documents or financial activities." Judge Okonkwo looked at him with barely concealed impatience. "Mr. Harrington, the witness is describing her observations, not providing expert financial analysis. Your objection is overruled. Please sit down." Margaret continued. "By June of 2021, I had recorded over 40 hours of voice notes documenting suspicious activities. But the most important evidence came on August 3rd. The courtroom grew very still. "What happened on August 3rd, Mrs. Brooks?" Sarah asked. "I discovered a document, or rather my friend Evelyn did. Evelyn Harper, God rest her soul. She passed last year, but before she did, she gave me something that changed everything." Margaret's voice wavered slightly, the first sign of emotion she had shown. Evelyn lived in Unit 52A. She had been a secretary for 40 years before retiring, and she still had an eye for paperwork. She came to me one day, very upset. She said she had found papers in the trash behind the administrative building, papers that had been shredded but not properly destroyed. What were these papers? They were accounting documents. Evelyn spent 2 weeks piecing them together with tape. When she brought them to me, she read them aloud. They showed transfers from residents' escrow accounts to offshore shell companies. My account was among them. 3 separate transfers totaling $87,000 had been taken from my funds without my knowledge or consent. James Morrison shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His attorneys huddled together, whispering urgently. "What did you do with this information, Mrs. Brooks?" "I knew we needed to protect it. So Michael scanned everything and stored copies in multiple secure locations. We also contacted the State Attorney General's office and the FBI. It took another year before they had enough evidence to act. But eventually, they did." Sarah nodded. "Mrs. Brooks, I'd like to turn to the personal impact of these events. Can you describe how Morrison Development's actions affected you personally?" For the first time, Margaret's composure cracked slightly. She took a moment to gather herself. "When I moved into Willow Creek, I believed I was securing my future. I had worked as a school teacher for 33 years, 4th grade mostly. I loved those children, and I tried to teach them not just reading and arithmetic, but also honesty and integrity. My husband was a postal worker. Neither of us ever made much money, but we saved every penny we could. That $273,000 represented our entire life's work." She paused, her hands trembling slightly. "When I discovered what Morrison had done, I felt violated, not just financially, but personally. These people had looked me in the eye, so to speak, and lied to me. They had taken advantage of my trust, my age, and my disability." "Objection," Harrington said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The witness is characterizing the defendant's intentions." "Overruled," Judge Okonkwo said firmly. "The witness is describing her personal feelings and experiences." Margaret continued. "After we reported the fraud, things got worse. Morrison's people began a campaign of harassment against me and the other residents who had spoken up. They moved me to a smaller unit on the ground floor, far from my friends. They reduced my meal service. They made me feel unwelcome in my own home." "Is that why you eventually left Willow Creek?" "Yes. By March of 2022, the situation had become unbearable. Michael moved me into his home, where I've been living ever since. I lost not only my money, but also my independence, my community, and many of my friends." Her voice grew stronger again. "But I did not lose my determination. I made a promise to Evelyn before she passed. I promised her that I would see this through, that I would stand in this courtroom and tell the truth about what happened to us, that I would make sure James Morrison and his company were held accountable." She turned her face toward the defense table. "Mr. Morrison, I cannot see your face, but I can feel your presence. And I want you to know that what you did was wrong. You preyed on elderly people who trusted you. You stole from us, lied to us, and then tried to silence us, but you failed. Because people like me, people you dismissed as old and helpless and blind, we remember. We remember everything." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Sarah Martinez let the moment breathe before continuing. "Mrs. Brooks, the defense has suggested in pre-trial motions that your blindness makes you an unreliable witness. How do you respond to that?" Margaret laughed softly. "I've been blind for 20 years, Ms. Martinez. In that time, I've learned that sight is just one way of perceiving the world, and frankly, it's not always the most reliable. Sighted people miss things all the time because they're distracted by what they see. They don't listen carefully. They don't pay attention to the subtle cues that tell you what's really happening." She leaned forward slightly. "I heard Mr. Patterson and Mr. Riley discussing their crimes. I recognized their voices as surely as I would recognize my own grandchildren's. I documented months of suspicious activity through careful observation. And I have a memory that would put most sighted people to shame, because when you can't write things down or look them up, you learn to remember. Your Honor, Sarah said, the prosecution rests. Judge Okonkwo nodded. We'll take a 15-minute recess before cross-examination. As the courtroom began to stir, Michael approached the witness stand to help his grandmother. He bent down to whisper in her ear. You were incredible, Grandma. She patted his hand. The hard part is coming, sweetheart, but I'm ready. In the hallway outside, Michael guided Margaret to a bench where she could rest. He brought her a cup of water and sat beside her. How are you feeling, really? Margaret sighed, tired but determined. I keep thinking about Evelyn, about all the others who suffered because of Morrison's greed. Dorothy Chen, who had to move in with her daughter because she couldn't afford her medications anymore. Robert Martinez, who died last year still believing he would get his money back. We owe it to them to see this through. You're amazing, you know that? I'm just stubborn, she said with a slight smile. Your grandfather always said I was the most stubborn woman he ever met. I told him that's why he married me. Michael laughed, but his expression grew serious. The defense is going to come at you hard. Harrington has a reputation for being ruthless. I know. I've heard the stories. But I've faced worse than a man in an expensive suit who thinks he's smarter than everyone else. I raised 3 children, taught hundreds more, and survived losing my sight and my husband. Mr. Harrington doesn't scare me. When the recess ended, Margaret made her way back to the witness stand. Richard Harrington stood, buttoning his suit jacket with practiced precision. Mrs. Brooks, he began, his voice smooth and courteous, I want to start by expressing my admiration for your composure today. It's clear you're an intelligent and articulate woman. Thank you, Mr. Harrington, though I suspect flattery isn't the main purpose of your cross-examination. A few chuckles came from the gallery. Harrington's smile tightened slightly. Indeed. Let's get to the substance. You testified that you overheard a conversation between Gerald Patterson and Thomas Riley on March 15th, 2021. Is that correct? Yes. And you claim to have identified these men by their voices alone. That is correct. Mrs. Brooks, isn't it possible that you were mistaken, that the voices you heard belonged to other individuals? No, Mr. Harrington, it is not possible. With respect, how can you be so certain? Margaret's response was calm and measured. I had known both Mr. Patterson and Mr. Riley for over 2 years at that point. I had spent countless hours in their company at community events, meetings, and casual conversations. I knew their voices as well as I know my own family's. Additionally, both men had distinctive speech patterns and personal characteristics that I described in my testimony. But you couldn't see them. You can't prove they were the individuals present. Mr. Harrington, if I told you that I could identify your voice in a crowd of 1,000 people, would you doubt me? I'm asking the questions here, Mrs. Brooks, and I'm answering them. The answer is no, I could not have been mistaken. I am as certain of what I heard as I am certain that we are having this conversation right now. Harrington shifted tactics. Let's discuss your voice recordings. You testified that you kept a voice journal documenting suspicious activities. Where are these recordings now? They have been submitted into evidence. My grandson Michael preserved them digitally and provided copies to the FBI and the State Attorney General's office. Did anyone verify the authenticity of these recordings? Sarah Martinez stood. Your Honor, the authenticity of the recordings was established in pre-trial proceedings. The defense had full opportunity to challenge them at that time. Sustained, Judge Okonkwo said. Move on, Mr. Harrington. Harrington's jaw tightened. Mrs. Brooks, isn't it true that you harbor a personal grudge against James Morrison? I harbor no grudge, Mr. Harrington. I seek justice. But you testified that you lost your money, your home, and your community because of actions you attribute to Morrison development. Couldn't that cloud your judgment? Margaret paused thoughtfully. Mr. Harrington, when I was a fourth-grade teacher, I taught my students that actions have consequences. I didn't teach them to hold grudges, but I did teach them to stand up for what's right. I'm not here because I want revenge. I'm here because what happened to me and dozens of other residents was wrong, and because if we don't speak up, it will happen to others. Noble sentiments, but let me ask you this. Before moving into Willow Creek, did you have any experience in finance or accounting? I was a school teacher, Mr. Harrington. I balanced my own checkbook and managed my household budget for 50 years. But you're not a financial expert. No, I'm not. Then how can you possibly understand the complex financial transactions you claim were fraudulent? Because my grandson Michael is a forensic accountant. He explained everything to me in terms I could understand. And because the FBI and State Attorney General investigated and found sufficient evidence to bring criminal charges against Mr. Morrison and his associates, charges that are pending in a separate proceeding. Harrington paused. This was a point he didn't want the jury to dwell on. Let's move on. You testified about documents that your friend Evelyn Harper allegedly found in the trash. Is that correct? Yes. And you claim these documents showed evidence of fraud? They did show evidence of fraud. Evelyn read them to me and Michael analyzed them professionally. But Evelyn Harper is deceased. She cannot verify your account. Margaret's voice grew cold. Evelyn died last year of heart failure, Mr. Harrington. She was 84 years old and had been fighting for justice alongside me for nearly 2 years. The stress of this situation certainly didn't help her health. I would ask you to show some respect for her memory. I meant no disrespect. I'm simply pointing out that we only have your word about what Evelyn found and what she told you. We have the documents themselves, Mr. Harrington. The actual papers that Evelyn pieced together. They are in evidence. Your client's own financial records showing unauthorized transfers from residents' accounts. Unless you're suggesting that Evelyn and I fabricated them? Harrington hesitated. The documents were indeed in evidence, and forensic analysis had confirmed their authenticity. It was not a line of questioning he wanted to pursue. Let me ask you about your move from Unit 47B to the ground floor. You characterize this as harassment. Isn't it possible it was simply a practical accommodation for your disability? I had been living in Unit 47B for 2 years without any problems, Mr. Harrington. The move came precisely 1 week after I filed my first complaint with management about billing irregularities. The ground floor unit was smaller, had a view of the parking lot instead of the garden, and was far from the community centre where my friends gathered. If it was an accommodation, it was a remarkably inconvenient one. But you can't prove it was retaliation. I can prove the timing. I can prove that other residents who complained experienced similar treatment, and I can prove that after I moved, my meal service was reduced and my requests for maintenance went unanswered. The pattern speaks for itself. Harrington was growing frustrated. Every line of attack was being deflected with calm, measured responses. He decided to go for what he thought was the jugular. Mrs. Brooks, I have to ask you directly. Given your disability, given the complexity of the financial matters at issue, given the passage of time, is it possible, just possible, that you've gotten things wrong? That your memory has failed you? That you've constructed a narrative that isn't entirely accurate? The courtroom went very still. Margaret turned her face toward the jury box. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried clearly to every corner of the room. Mr. Harrington, I have been blind for 20 years. In that time, I have never once used my disability as an excuse for anything. I have learned to navigate the world without sight, to live independently, to remember what others forget because I cannot simply look something up. I have also learned to be very, very careful about what I say, because I know that people like you will always be ready to question me. She paused. I have gotten nothing wrong. My memory has not failed me, and the narrative I have presented is not constructed. It is the truth, every word of it." She turned back toward Harrington. "You asked if I hold a grudge against your client. Let me tell you something, Mr. Harrington. When my husband Walter died, I thought my life was over. Moving to Willow Creek was supposed to be my fresh start. I was supposed to spend my remaining years in peace, surrounded by friends, cared for by people I could trust. Instead, I was robbed, lied to, harassed, forced from my home." Her voice grew stronger, but I did not give up. I gathered evidence. I worked with my grandson and my friends. I reported what I knew to the authorities, and now I am here, telling my story to this jury so that they can decide what happened. That is not a grudge, Mr. Harrington. That is justice. And I will not stop fighting for it until every person responsible for what happened is held accountable. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Richard Harrington stood frozen for a moment. He had tried everything, attacking her credibility, questioning her memory, suggesting bias, and attempting to use her disability against her. Nothing had worked. If anything, his aggressive questioning had only made her more sympathetic to the jury. He glanced back at his colleagues. Bradley Chen shook his head slightly. There was no point in continuing. "No further questions, Your Honor." As Harrington returned to the defense table, James Morrison grabbed his arm. "What the hell was that?" he hissed. "You were supposed to destroy her." "Keep your voice down," Harrington whispered back. "She's not what we expected. We need to regroup." At the plaintiff's table, Sarah Martinez allowed herself a small smile. She had known Margaret was a powerful witness, but today's testimony had exceeded her hopes. "Your Honor," she said, "the plaintiff has no redirect." Judge Okonkwo nodded. "Mrs. Brooks, you may step down. The court will take a 30-minute recess before we continue with additional witnesses." As Margaret carefully descended from the witness stand, something unexpected happened. In the gallery, an elderly woman began to clap. Then another. Within moments, a wave of applause swept through the courtroom. Judge Okonkwo banged her gavel. "Order! This is a court of law, not a theater." But even as the applause subsided, the impact was clear. The jury had seen everything. They had watched Margaret Brooks face down a team of expensive lawyers and emerge unshaken. They had heard her story, felt her pain, and witnessed her dignity. And they believed her. Michael helped Margaret through the crowd of supporters who had gathered in the hallway. Many were former Willow Creek residents or their family members. "Mrs. Brooks, thank you so much. You spoke for all of us." "God bless you, Margaret." Margaret accepted their thanks graciously, but she was exhausted. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the testimony was beginning to fade, and she felt every one of her 78 years. "Let's find somewhere quiet," Michael said, guiding her toward a small conference room that Sarah Martinez had reserved. Once inside, Margaret sank into a chair. Sarah entered a moment later, her face beaming. "Margaret, that was extraordinary. The jury was completely with you." "How could you tell?" Margaret asked with a tired smile. "Body language. They were leaning forward, nodding along. Some of them were actually glaring at Harrington. When you talked about Evelyn, 2 of the women on the jury were wiping their eyes." Margaret nodded slowly. "I meant every word. Evelyn deserved to see this day. So many of them did." Sarah sat down across from her. "We still have 3 more days of testimony, but I have to be honest with you. What you did today may have won this case. The financial evidence is strong, but juries make decisions based on people, not numbers, and you made this case about people." "What happens now?" "We have 2 more witnesses today. Frank Yoshida, who was the head of the Residents' Council and first documented the billing discrepancies, and your grandson Michael, who will walk through the financial evidence. Tomorrow, we have expert witnesses. Then it's the defense's turn." "Do you think they'll put Morrison on the stand?" Sarah considered. I doubt it. After what happened today, they'll be terrified of what might come out under cross-examination. They'll probably try to poke holes in our evidence and present alternative explanations for the financial irregularities. But honestly, I think they're running scared. Michael, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. What about the criminal case? That's separate and ongoing. The FBI and State Attorney General are building their case, and regardless of what happens here, Morrison and his associates are facing serious federal and state charges. But a civil verdict in our favor will certainly help. Margaret reached out and Sarah took her hand. Sarah, I want you to know how grateful I am. You took this case when no one else would. You believed us when others thought we were just confused old people. Whatever happens, I will never forget that. Sarah squeezed her hand. I took this case because it was the right thing to do, and because of people like you, Margaret, people who refuse to be victims, people who fight back. The afternoon session brought Frank Yoshida to the stand. Frank was 73, a retired engineer who had moved to Willow Creek in 2018. He had been the one to first notice the discrepancies in the monthly statements and had organized the Residents' Council investigation. His testimony was more technical than Margaret's, focused on the specific documents and financial records that had revealed the fraud. But he painted a picture of a community coming together, elderly residents pooling their knowledge and resources to uncover the truth. We weren't going to be pushed around, Frank said firmly. We may be old, but we're not stupid. Many of us had decades of professional experience. Engineers, teachers, nurses, accountants, lawyers. We knew something was wrong, and we were determined to prove it. When Richard Harrington cross-examined him, he fared no better than he had with Margaret. Frank was equally composed, equally certain, and equally devastating in his responses. Mr. Yoshida, Harrington tried, isn't it possible that what you perceived as irregularities were simply standard accounting practices you didn't understand? Frank fixed him with a steady gaze. Mr. Harrington, I spent 41 years as a structural engineer. I designed bridges that had to hold up under tremendous stress. I understand analysis. I understand when numbers don't add up. And these numbers don't add up. By the time Michael Brooks took the stand late in the afternoon, the defense team looked defeated. Michael walked through the financial evidence methodically, explaining how the shell companies had been structured, how the money had been moved, and how the paper trail led directly to Morrison Development's leadership. His testimony was detailed and complex, but he had a gift for making complicated concepts understandable. He used simple analogies and clear explanations, just as Margaret had taught him when he was a child, struggling with math homework. Think of it like a magic trick, he explained to the jury. The money was here, he pointed to a diagram, in the residents' escrow accounts. Then Morrison's people waved their hands, created some fake paperwork, and suddenly the money was over here, in accounts they controlled overseas. But unlike a magic trick, this wasn't sleight of hand, this was theft. Harrington's cross-examination was brief and ineffective. By this point, the defense strategy had shifted from winning to damage control. That evening, Margaret sat in Michael's living room, listening to the local news coverage of the trial. In a dramatic day of testimony, the anchor reported, 78-year-old Margaret Brooks took the stand in the case against Morrison Development Corporation. Brooks, who has been blind for 20 years, delivered a powerful account of alleged fraud and harassment at the Willow Creek senior living community. Observers say the defense team's attempts to discredit her backfired spectacularly. Michael muted the television. You're famous, Grandma. I don't want to be famous, Margaret said. I just want justice. You're going to get it. I can feel it. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Michael, do you remember when you were little and you came to visit me at school? You sat in on one of my classes. I remember. You were teaching the kids about the Constitution. Do you remember what I told them about justice? Michael smiled. You said justice isn't something that happens to us. It's something we have to make happen. We have to fight for it. I've been fighting for 3 years, Margaret said softly. I'm tired, Michael, so tired, but we're almost there. I can feel it. You should rest. Tomorrow's another big day. Margaret nodded and let Michael help her to her room. As she lay in bed, she thought about Walter, about Evelyn, about all the residents who had suffered. She thought about the young lawyers who had mocked her, about Morrison sitting stone-faced at the defense table, about the jury who held their fate in their hands. She had done everything she could. Now she had to trust the system she had spent a lifetime believing in. The next 2 days of testimony passed in a blur. Expert witnesses explained the forensic accounting methods used to trace the missing funds. Former employees of Morrison Development testified about the pressure they had faced to falsify records. The defense presented its own witnesses, but their explanations rang hollow against the weight of evidence. Finally, closing arguments arrived. Sarah Martinez stood before the jury, speaking without notes. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about trust. The residents of Willow Creek trusted Morrison Development with their life savings, their homes, and their futures. They trusted that when they handed over hundreds of thousands of dollars, that money would be protected. That trust was betrayed. She walked slowly in front of the jury box. You've heard from the victims themselves. Margaret Brooks, who lost her sight but never lost her clarity, her memory, or her determination to fight for what's right. Frank Yoshida, who used his engineering expertise to expose a fraud that others wanted to keep hidden. Michael Brooks, who left no stone unturned in tracing where the money went. The defense wants you to believe that this was all a misunderstanding, that the missing funds were just accounting errors, that the harassment the residents faced was coincidental. But you've seen the evidence, you've heard the testimony, you know the truth. She paused, looking at each juror in turn. James Morrison and his company stole from the most vulnerable members of our society. They stole from the elderly, from the disabled, from people who had worked their entire lives to save for a dignified retirement. And when those people fought back, Morrison tried to silence them. But he failed. Because people like Margaret Brooks don't stay silent. They speak truth to power. They stand up in courtrooms like this one and tell their stories, no matter how hard others try to discredit them. Sarah's voice grew stronger. I'm asking you to send a message today, a message that fraud will not be tolerated, that elderly people are not easy targets, that blind witnesses are not unreliable, that justice is for everyone, regardless of age or ability or social standing. Find for the plaintiffs, hold Morrison Development accountable, give these residents back their dignity, even if we can never give them back everything they lost. Thank you. Richard Harrington's closing argument was polished but defensive. He emphasized the complexity of the financial arrangements, suggested that the residents had misunderstood legitimate business practices, and questioned the reliability of the evidence. But even as he spoke, he seemed to know it was futile. The jury wasn't looking at him anymore. They were looking at Margaret Brooks, sitting quietly in the gallery, her face serene and patient. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. When they returned with their verdict, the courtroom was packed. Margaret sat between Michael and Sarah, her hands folded in her lap. In the matter of the residents of Willow Creek Senior Living Community versus Morrison Development Corporation, the jury foreperson read, "We find for the plaintiffs on all counts." A cheer erupted in the courtroom. Judge Okonkwo let it continue for a moment before calling for order. The jury has further determined that the plaintiffs are entitled to full recovery of all funds taken, totaling $47,800,000 plus punitive damages of $100 million. The defense table erupted in protests. James Morrison slumped in his chair, his face ashen. His attorneys were already talking about appeals. But at the plaintiff's table, Margaret Brooks sat quietly, tears streaming down her face. Michael hugged her tight. "We did it, Grandma. We won." "We won for Evelyn," Margaret whispered. "We won for all of them." Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but Margaret barely noticed any of it. Sarah Martinez found her in the crowd and took her hand. "Margaret, I've been practicing law for 20 years. I've never seen a witness do what you did in that courtroom. You didn't just testify, you changed lives." "What happens now?" Margaret asked. "The criminal case will continue. Morrison and his associates will almost certainly go to prison. The civil judgment will be appealed, but I'm confident it will be upheld. And most importantly, the money will be recovered. Not all of it immediately, but eventually every resident who was defrauded will get their money back. Even the ones who have passed, their estates will receive compensation. We'll make sure of it." A young reporter pushed through the crowd. Mrs. Brooks, how does it feel to have won?" Margaret turned toward the voice. "It feels like justice. Finally." "The defense suggested throughout the trial that your blindness made you unreliable. Do you have anything to say to them?" Margaret smiled. "I would say that they underestimated me. They assumed that because I couldn't see, I couldn't perceive. But perception isn't just about sight. It's about attention, memory, and truth. I heard what I heard. I remembered what I remembered. And I spoke the truth. That's all any of us can do." "Any advice for others who might be in similar situations?" "Yes. Don't give up. Don't let anyone tell you that you're too old, too disabled, too insignificant to matter. Your voice has power. Use it. Fight for what's right. And remember that justice, while slow, is possible. We proved that today." As Michael led her toward the car, Margaret felt a peace she hadn't experienced in 3 years. The battle wasn't completely over. There would be appeals and more proceedings, but the hardest part was done. She had kept her promise to Evelyn. She had spoken for those who could no longer speak for themselves, and she had shown the world that a blind grandmother was more than capable of proving everyone wrong. The drive home was quiet. Michael kept glancing at his grandmother, worried about her energy after such an emotional day. "How are you feeling, really?" he asked. "I feel like I could sleep for a week," Margaret admitted, "but I also feel lighter. Like I've been carrying a weight and it's finally been lifted." "You should be proud of yourself. What you did today took incredible courage." Margaret shook her head. "It wasn't courage, Michael. It was necessity. When you see something wrong, truly wrong, you have 2 choices. You can look away or you can stand up. I made my choice the day I overheard that conversation in the community room." "Did you ever doubt yourself? Ever think maybe you should just let it go?" "Every day," Margaret said honestly. "Every single day. There was a moment when I thought, I'm too old for this. Let someone else fight." But then I would think about the others. Dorothy, who was eating cat food because she couldn't afford groceries. Harold, who had to borrow money from his daughter for his medication. Evelyn, who died still hoping for justice. She paused. I couldn't let them down. I couldn't let myself down, and I couldn't let Walter down. He spent his whole life believing that honesty and hard work would be rewarded. What Morrison did was an insult to everything Walter stood for. They arrived at Michael's house, a modest but comfortable home, in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Michael's wife, Jennifer, was waiting at the door with their 2 children, 8-year-old Sophie and 11-year-old Marcus. "Grandma!" Sophie ran to hug Margaret as she emerged from the car. "Mom said you won. She said you were a superhero." Margaret laughed and bent down to embrace her great-granddaughter. "I'm no superhero, sweetheart. I'm just a stubborn old woman who doesn't like being cheated." Marcus, more reserved than his sister, approached slowly. "I watched some of the news coverage at school," he said. "You were really brave, Grandma." "Thank you, Marcus. But you know what would make me even happier than winning?" "What?" "A glass of your grandmother's iced tea and a quiet evening with my family. Can we do that?" Inside, Jennifer had prepared a celebration dinner. Nothing fancy, just Margaret's favorite pot roast with vegetables and fresh bread. The family gathered around the table, and for the first time in 3 years, Margaret felt truly at peace. "Tell us about the trial, Grandma," Sophie begged. "Tell us everything." So Margaret told them. She told them about the nervous feeling in her stomach as she walked into the courtroom, about the smell of old wood and furniture polish, about the way the judge's voice echoed off the high ceilings, about Richard Harrington's expensive cologne and the squeak in his Italian leather shoes. "And then," she said, lowering her voice dramatically, "he asked me if I could really identify people by their voices. And I said, 'Mr. Harrington, I can tell you that you had eggs for breakfast because I can smell it on your breath from here.'" The children dissolved into giggles. Even Jennifer, who had heard the story already, couldn't help but smile. "What did he do?" Marcus asked. "He sat down very quickly and didn't talk to me quite the same way after that." "Serves him right," Sophie declared with 8-year-old certainty. "He shouldn't have been mean to you." "He wasn't being mean exactly," Margaret explained gently. "He was doing his job, trying to defend his client. It's how the system works. But he made a mistake that a lot of people make. He assumed that because I'm old and blind, I must be weak and confused. He learned otherwise." After dinner, as the children reluctantly headed off to bed, Margaret asked Michael to help her to the porch. The evening air was warm, carrying the scent of honeysuckle from the neighbor's garden. "I want to tell you something," Margaret said once they were settled. "Something I've been thinking about for a while." "What is it, Grandma?" "When this started 3 years ago, I was angry, so angry, at Morrison, at his people, at the whole situation. I felt like my world had been torn apart, and I wanted someone to pay for it." She paused, gathering her thoughts. But somewhere along the way, the anger changed. It became something else. Purpose, maybe, or determination. "I stopped wanting revenge and started wanting justice. Real justice, not just for me, but for everyone who was hurt." "That's what made you so powerful on the stand," Michael said. "You weren't bitter, you were righteous." "I don't know about righteous, but I knew I was telling the truth, and I knew that the truth, in the end, would be enough." "It was more than enough. The jury saw exactly who you are, and they trusted you completely." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "Michael, there's something else I want to talk about." "Anything." "I've been thinking about what happens next, not just the legal proceedings, but my life, where I go from here." Michael turned to look at her. "You'll always have a home with us. You know that." "I know, and I'm more grateful for that than I can say. But I'm 78 years old, and today showed me that I still have something to contribute. Something more than just being someone's grandmother." "What are you thinking?" Margaret smiled. "There's an organization, the National Coalition for Senior Rights. They reached out to me last week before the trial. They want me to become an advocate, to speak out about elder fraud and abuse, to help others who are going through what we went through." "That's wonderful," Michael said. "But are you sure you're up for it? It would mean traveling, speaking engagements, a lot of stress." "Michael, I just spent 3 years fighting a corporate giant and won. I think I can handle a few speeches." He laughed. "Fair point." "I want to use this moment," Margaret continued, "this attention, this platform. I want to make sure that what happened at Willow Creek never happens again, not to anyone." "Then you should do it. We'll support you, whatever you decide." Margaret reached over and found Michael's hand. "You've been my rock through all of this. You believed me when others doubted. You gave up weekends and holidays to help me fight. I could never have done this without you." "You would have found a way, Grandma. You always do." "Maybe, but I'm glad I didn't have to." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the suburban evening, a dog barking in the distance, a car passing on the street, children laughing somewhere down the block. "Do you remember what Grandpa used to say about trouble?" Margaret asked. "He said trouble is just opportunity wearing a disguise. I never believed it until now. All that trouble, all that pain, and here we are, stronger, closer, with a chance to help others. Maybe Walter was right after all. He was right about a lot of things. He was. He was right about me, for one. He always said I was destined for greatness, even when I was just a fourth-grade teacher in a small town. I used to laugh at him.
He wasn't wrong.
Margaret shook her head. I'm not great, Michael. I'm just someone who refused to give up. Anyone can do that. The question is whether they will. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The civil judgment made national headlines, and Morrison Development's stock plummeted. Criminal indictments followed quickly. James Morrison, Gerald Patterson, Thomas Riley, and 4 other executives were charged with multiple counts of wire fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. Margaret watched from the sidelines as the criminal proceedings began, but she wasn't just an observer anymore. True to her word, she had joined the National Coalition for Senior Rights as a spokesperson and advocate. Her first public appearance was at a congressional hearing on elder financial abuse. Sarah Martinez accompanied her to Washington, where Margaret testified before the Senate Special Committee on Aging. The hearing room was packed with senators, staffers, and press. Margaret, dressed in a simple navy blue suit, approached the witness table with her familiar, confident gait, her white cane tapping softly against the marble floor. Senator Patricia Williams, the committee chair, welcomed her warmly. Mrs. Brooks, thank you for joining us today. Your testimony in the Morrison trial captured the nation's attention. We're honored to have you here. Thank you, Senator. I'm honored to be here, though I wish the circumstances were different. Can you tell us in your own words what brought you here today? Margaret cleared her throat. I'm here because what happened to me and my neighbors at Willow Creek wasn't unusual. It's happening every day, all across this country. Elder financial abuse costs Americans billions of dollars annually. It destroys lives, breaks up families, and robs hard-working people of their security and dignity. She leaned forward slightly. I'm here to tell you that the current system is broken. The regulations meant to protect seniors are inadequate. The enforcement mechanisms are weak, and too often, the victims are blamed for their own victimization. They're told they should have known better, should have read the fine print, should have been more careful. What would you like to see change? Senator Williams asked. First, stronger regulations on retirement communities and assisted living facilities, mandatory audits, transparent financial reporting, strict licensing requirements for anyone handling residents' funds. Second, better enforcement. When fraud is discovered, the perpetrators should face real consequences, not just slaps on the wrist. James Morrison stole nearly $50 million from elderly victims. He should never see the outside of a prison again. Third, support for victims. People who have been defrauded need help navigating the legal system, recovering their assets and rebuilding their lives. That help should be available to everyone, not just those lucky enough to have a forensic accountant in the family. A murmur of appreciation rippled through the hearing room. And finally, Margaret continued, we need to change the culture. We need to stop treating elderly people as easy targets and start treating them as the valuable, experienced, capable members of society they are. Age and disability do not equal vulnerability. They can equal wisdom, determination, and strength. The testimony continued for over an hour, with senators from both parties asking questions and expressing support. By the end, there were informal commitments to new legislation, increased funding for enforcement, and a national awareness campaign on elder financial abuse. As Margaret left the hearing room, she was surrounded by reporters and well-wishers, but she was focused on something else entirely. She had received word that morning that the criminal jury had begun deliberations in James Morrison's trial. The criminal trial had been shorter than the civil case, largely because so much evidence had already been established. The prosecutors presented a streamlined case, focusing on the most egregious examples of fraud and the clearest evidence of criminal intent. James Morrison had not taken the stand in his own defense. His attorneys had tried to shift blame to underlings and characterize the fraud as a few rogue employees acting without authorization. But the paper trail was too clear. The conspiracy was too extensive. And Margaret Brooks's testimony, which was replayed for the criminal jury, was too compelling. The criminal jury deliberated for 3 days. On the morning of the verdict, Margaret was at Michael's house pretending to read a book in Braille while really just running her fingers over the same page repeatedly. Michael was working from home, checking his phone every few minutes. Jennifer had taken the children to school and stayed home, unable to focus on anything else. When the phone finally rang, Michael answered it on the first ring. "This is Michael Brooks." A pause. Yes, I understand, thank you." He hung up and turned to his grandmother. "Guilty on all counts, all 7 defendants." Margaret's hands stopped moving over the Braille page. She sat very still for a long moment. "Evelyn," she finally whispered, "we did it, old friend, we did it." Jennifer crossed to Margaret and hugged her tightly. Michael joined them, and for a few minutes the 3 of them just held each other, releasing the tension of 3 years. "What happens now?" Jennifer asked. "Sentencing in 6 weeks, Michael said. "Morrison is looking at up to 30 years. The others will get less, but they're all going to prison." "Good," Margaret said firmly. "That's where they belong." The evening news led with the verdict. Every channel covered the story, replaying clips from the trial, showing Morrison being led away in handcuffs, interviewing former residents of Willow Creek who had gathered outside the courthouse. One interview caught Margaret's attention. It was Dorothy Chen, the elderly woman who had been reduced to eating cat food because Morrison's fraud had left her unable to afford groceries. She was standing with her daughter, tears streaming down her face. "I never thought I'd see this day," Dorothy said. "When it started, when we first realized what they'd done, I thought there was no hope. We were just old people. Who was going to listen to us? Who was going to believe us?" She paused, wiping her eyes. But Margaret wouldn't give up. She kept fighting, even when the rest of us wanted to quit. She told us that the truth would win if we just kept telling it. And she was right. She was right. Margaret turned away from the television, suddenly overwhelmed. "Are you okay?" Michael asked, concerned. "I'm fine. I never wanted to be a hero, Michael. I just wanted to do what was right." Sometimes that's the same thing. Over the following months, Margaret threw herself into advocacy work. She testified before state legislatures. She spoke at conferences. She met with victims of elder fraud across the country, offering guidance and encouragement. She also made time for the people who had been with her from the beginning. Frank Yoshida was now chairing a new residence council at a different retirement community, implementing the kind of financial oversight that might have prevented the Willow Creek disaster. Sarah Martinez had been named to a national task force on consumer protection. And Michael had left his corporate job to start a non-profit dedicated to forensic accounting services for victims of financial fraud. On the 1-year anniversary of the criminal verdict, a small ceremony was held at the courthouse where the trial had taken place. The courtroom was filled with former Willow Creek residents, their families, attorneys, and advocates. Judge Patricia Okonkwo, who had presided over the civil trial, was there as well. She approached Margaret before the ceremony began. "Mrs. Brooks, I want you to know something. In 30 years on the bench, I've seen countless witnesses take the stand. Very few of them made the impression you did." Margaret smiled. "Thank you, Your Honor, though I suspect a lot of that was just stubbornness on my part." Stubbornness in pursuit of justice is a virtue, not a fault. The judge lowered her voice. "What you did in my courtroom that day, the way you handled Harrington's cross-examination, it was masterful. You turned his own tactics against him and never lost your composure. I just told the truth, Your Honor. That's all any of us can do. Perhaps, but you told it in a way that the jury couldn't ignore. You made them see, if you'll forgive the expression, what was really happening. That's a rare gift. The ceremony itself was simple. Sarah Martinez spoke first, reflecting on the journey from the first complaint to the final verdict. Frank Yoshida spoke about the community that had come together to fight back. Michael spoke about his grandmother's determination and the lessons he had learned from her. Finally, Margaret was invited to the podium. She approached slowly, her cane finding the microphone stand, then set it aside. "A little over 4 years ago," she began, "I moved into Willow Creek Senior Living Community. I was a recent widow, still grieving, looking for a new chapter in my life. I had no idea that chapter would include fraud, harassment, and a 3-year legal battle. When we discovered what Morrison and his people had done, some of us wanted to give up. We were old, we were tired. Some of us had disabilities that made fighting seem impossible. Who would believe us? Who would take our side against a powerful corporation with expensive lawyers and endless resources?" The answer, it turned out, was many people. Sarah Martinez, who took our case when others wouldn't. Michael, who devoted years of his life to helping us prove what had happened. And most importantly, each other. We believed in each other. We supported each other. We refused to let each other give up. Margaret paused, gathering herself. "I want to acknowledge those who aren't here today. Evelyn Harper, who found the evidence that cracked the case open. She passed away before she could see justice done, but I know she's watching from somewhere. Harold Thompson, Robert Martinez, Gladys Washington, and too many others who didn't live to see this day. We remember them, we honor them, and we carry their memory forward. I also want to speak to those who are listening who might be going through something similar. If you're being exploited, abused, or defrauded, please know that you are not alone. There are people who will believe you. There are systems that can help you. It won't be easy and it won't be quick, but justice is possible. We proved that here. Finally, I want to speak to those who underestimate the elderly and disabled, the lawyers who mocked me, the executives who thought we were easy targets, the people who assume that because I'm old and blind, I must be weak and confused." Margaret's voice grew strong and clear. "We are not weak. We are not confused. We have lived long lives and learned hard lessons. We have raised families, built careers, and contributed to our communities in countless ways. We deserve respect. We deserve protection. And when those are denied to us, we will fight back. I am 79 years old. I have been blind for 21 years, and I stood in this very courtroom and helped bring a corporate criminal to justice. If I can do that, imagine what all of us together can accomplish." She raised her white cane in the air. "This is not a symbol of disability. This is a symbol of adaptation, resilience, and determination. Every person in this room has their own version of this cane, their own way of navigating challenges that others might see as insurmountable. Use them, trust them, and never ever let anyone tell you that you can't." The applause was thunderous. Margaret stood at the podium, tears streaming down her face, feeling the vibration of hundreds of hands clapping, the warmth of hundreds of hearts connected to hers. Afterward, as the crowd began to disperse, a young woman approached Margaret. She was perhaps 30, with dark hair and anxious eyes. "Mrs. Brooks, my name is Rebecca Morrison." Margaret tilted her head slightly, recognizing the name. "I'm James Morrison's daughter," Rebecca continued, her voice trembling. "I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but I needed to say something." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm listening. I wanted to apologize for what my father did, for all of it. I had no idea what was happening at Willow Creek. When it all came out, when I saw the evidence, I was horrified. My own father, stealing from elderly people, ruining lives. I don't know how he could do it." "Neither do I," Margaret said gently. "I've been trying to make amends. I set up a scholarship fund for the grandchildren and great-grandchildren of the victims. I volunteer at a senior center in my community. I know it doesn't make up for what happened, but I have to do something." Margaret reached out and found Rebecca's hand. "You are not responsible for your father's crimes. You can't carry that guilt, but the fact that you're trying to make things right, that matters. That says something about who you are." "Thank you," Rebecca whispered. "You're more gracious than I deserve." "We're all more gracious than we deserve, child. That's what grace means." Rebecca squeezed Margaret's hand, then stepped back into the crowd. Margaret never saw her again, but she thought about that conversation often in the years that followed. The sentencing hearing came 6 weeks later. James Morrison received the maximum sentence, 30 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. He would likely die behind bars. The other defendants received sentences ranging from 5 to 20 years. At the hearing, victims and their families were given the opportunity to make impact statements. Many spoke of their losses, their suffering, and their long road to recovery. Margaret spoke last. "Mr. Morrison," she said, addressing the defendant directly, "I have spent a lot of time thinking about you, about what drove you to do what you did, about whether you understood the harm you were causing or simply didn't care. I've concluded that it doesn't matter. Whatever your motivations, your actions destroyed lives. You took everything from people who had worked their entire lives to build a secure future. You left elderly men and women homeless, hungry, and hopeless. But you also did something you didn't intend. You brought us together. You gave us a common cause. You showed us that even in our weakness, we could find strength. Even in our isolation, we could find community. Even in our despair, we could find hope. So thank you, Mr. Morrison, not for what you did, but for what you taught us. You taught us that we are stronger than we knew. You taught us that justice, while slow, is possible. And you taught us that no matter how powerful the enemy, ordinary people standing together can prevail. I forgive you, Mr. Morrison, not because you deserve it, but because carrying hatred is exhausting, and I have better things to do with my remaining years. But I do not forget, and I will spend every day of my life making sure that what happened to us never happens to anyone else." She turned and walked slowly from the courtroom, her white cane tapping its familiar rhythm against the floor. 2 years later, Margaret passed away peacefully in her sleep at Michael's home. She was 81 years old. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people, former students, fellow advocates, Willow Creek survivors, and people from across the country whose lives she had touched through her advocacy work. Michael delivered the eulogy. "My grandmother used to say that life isn't about what happens to you. It's about what you do with what happens." She lived that philosophy every day. When she lost her sight, she learned to see the world in new ways. When she lost her husband, she found new purpose. When she was defrauded and harassed, she fought back with everything she had. She didn't set out to be a hero. She didn't want fame or attention. She just wanted what was right, and when the world tried to tell her that she was too old, too blind, too vulnerable to make a difference, she proved it wrong. The lawyers mocked her. They underestimated her. They thought a blind old woman couldn't possibly challenge their power until she took the stand, until she told her truth, until she showed them and showed all of us what real strength looks like. My grandmother's legacy isn't just in the laws that were changed or the criminals who were convicted. It's in the thousands of elderly and disabled people who now know that their voices matter, who know that when someone tells them they're too old or too weak to fight, they can look to Margaret Ellen Brooks and say, that's what they told her too, and she proved them wrong. Michael paused, composing himself. Grandma used to have a saying, "Never let anyone tell you what you can't do. You're the only one who gets to decide that." She decided she could expose a fraud. She decided she could stand up to powerful corporations. She decided she could change the world. And she was right. The congregation sang Margaret's favorite hymn as her casket was carried from the church. Outside, the sun was shining, and somewhere in the distance, a cardinal was singing. Margaret Ellen Brooks was laid to rest beside her husband Walter in the small cemetery where they had always planned to be buried together. The headstone they shared bore a simple inscription: Walter and Margaret Brooks, beloved partners in life, truth and justice prevail. But there was one addition that Margaret had requested in her will. Beneath the inscription, carved in smaller letters, were the words, "They said she couldn't, she did." 3 months after Margaret's funeral, a package arrived at Michael's home. It contained a letter and a small box. The letter was from the National Coalition for Senior Rights. "Dear Mr. Brooks," it read, "it is our honor to inform you that your grandmother, Margaret Ellen Brooks, has been posthumously awarded the Coalition's Lifetime Achievement Award for her exceptional contributions to elder rights advocacy. Her courage, determination, and tireless work have inspired countless individuals and contributed to significant legislative reforms. Enclosed is the award itself, along with a proclamation that has been read into the congressional record. Mrs. Brooks's legacy will be preserved in the Coalition's Hall of Honor, where her story will continue to inspire future generations." Michael opened the box. Inside was a crystal award engraved with Margaret's name and the Coalition's motto, "Every voice matters." He set it on the mantel beside a photograph of Margaret, one of the last taken of her at a speaking engagement just months before her death. In the photo, she was standing at a podium, her white cane in one hand, her face alight with the passion and determination that had defined her final years. "You really did it, Grandma," Michael whispered. "You changed the world." That evening, Michael gathered his family for dinner. Sophie was now 10, Marcus 13, and both were old enough to understand the significance of the award. "Your great-grandmother received something special today," Michael said, showing them the Crystal Award. "It's recognition for everything she did to help elderly people and fight against fraud." "She was so brave," Sophie said softly. "I wish I could have told her one more time." "She knew, sweetheart. She knew how much we all loved her and how proud we were of her." "Dad," Marcus asked, "do you think I could ever do something like she did? Make that kind of difference?" Michael smiled. "Your grandmother would have said that you already can. The question is whether you will. Every day we face choices about whether to stand up for what's right or look the other way. She chose to stand up. That's all it takes." "She also would have said that you don't have to be old to start," Jennifer added. "Marcus, you stood up for your friend when he was being bullied last year. Sophie, you organized that food drive at your school. Those things matter. That's how change begins." That night, after the children were in bed, Michael sat alone on the porch where he had spent so many evenings with his grandmother. The stars were bright, and the air was cool with the first hint of autumn. He thought about everything she had taught him, not just about forensic accounting or legal strategy, but about life, about resilience, about the power of truth spoken clearly and without fear. He thought about the people she had helped, the lives she had changed, the systems she had fought to reform. He thought about the ripples spreading outward from her actions, touching people she would never meet in places she would never go. And he made a promise to carry her legacy forward, to continue the work she had started, to never let anyone tell him or anyone else what they couldn't do. Because Margaret Ellen Brooks had proved that a blind grandmother could take on a corporate giant and win. She had proved that age and disability were not barriers to courage. She had proved that justice, however delayed, could be achieved. And she had proved once and for all that no one should ever underestimate the power of someone who refuses to give up. The story of Margaret Ellen Brooks didn't end with her death. It continued in the legislation that bore her name, the Margaret Brooks Elder Protection Act, which established new standards for financial oversight of retirement communities across the country. It continued in the thousands of elderly fraud victims who found the courage to come forward because of her example. It continued in the young advocates who cited her testimony as the moment they decided to dedicate their lives to elder rights. It continued in the courtrooms, where her story was told again and again, reminding judges and juries that the most powerful witness isn't always the most credentialed or the most able-bodied, but the one who speaks with absolute conviction and unwavering truth. And it continued in a small cemetery beside a man she had loved for 50 years, where visitors still leave flowers and notes thanking her for showing them what courage looks like. The lawyers had mocked her. They had underestimated her. They had assumed that her blindness made her weak, her age made her confused, and her vulnerability made her an easy target. They were wrong. Margaret Ellen Brooks saw more clearly than any of them, and in the end, she made the whole world see too. On the first anniversary of the Margaret Brooks Elder Protection Act, a ceremony was held on the steps of the Capitol. Senators from both parties spoke about the importance of protecting elderly Americans. Advocates described the progress that had been made and the work that remained. But the most powerful moment came when Michael Brooks took the podium. He didn't give a speech. Instead, he simply read from his grandmother's testimony, the words that had echoed through that courtroom years before. "I have been blind for 20 years, he read, his voice strong and clear. "In that time, I have learned that sight is just one way of perceiving the world, and frankly, it's not always the most reliable. I heard what I heard. I remembered what I remembered, and I spoke the truth. That's all any of us can do." He paused, looking out at the crowd gathered before him. Former Willow Creek residents, elder rights advocates, politicians and journalists, ordinary citizens who had come to honor an extraordinary woman. "My grandmother believed that every person has a voice that deserves to be heard," Michael continued. "She believed that truth, spoken with courage and conviction, can overcome even the most powerful opposition. She believed that age is not a barrier to action, disability is not a barrier to perception, and vulnerability is not a barrier to strength." She proved all of that in a courtroom, facing down lawyers who mocked her and executives who had stolen her life savings. She proved it in the halls of Congress, testifying for reforms that would protect millions. She proved it in every speech, every interview, every conversation, where she encouraged someone to stand up and fight for what's right. Today, we honor her memory by continuing her work. The Margaret Brooks Elder Protection Act is a significant step forward, but there is so much more to do. Elder fraud continues. Financial exploitation continues. People continue to take advantage of those they perceive as weak or vulnerable. But as long as we remember Margaret Brooks, as long as we tell her story, as long as we follow her example, the fight will continue. And eventually, justice will prevail. It always does. He stepped back from the podium and the crowd erupted in applause. That night, as Michael drove home, he passed the courthouse where his grandmother had given her testimony. He slowed down, looking at the building where everything had changed. He remembered her face as she sat in the witness chair, calm and composed despite the pressure. He remembered the way she had turned toward Harrington and dismantled his attacks with quiet precision. He remembered the applause that had erupted when she finished, breaking the courtroom's solemnity for just a moment. And he remembered what she had said to him afterward, in the hallway outside. "The hardest part isn't the fighting, Michael. The hardest part is deciding to fight in the first place. Once you make that decision, everything else follows." She had made that decision, and because of it, lives had been saved, justice had been served, and the world was a little bit better than it had been before. Michael smiled, wiped a tear from his eye, and continued on his way home. The legacy of Margaret Ellen Brooks lived on, not just in the laws and institutions that bore her name, but in every person who chose to stand up when they could have stayed silent, to fight when they could have surrendered, to speak truth when lies would have been easier. She had been mocked by lawyers who thought they knew better. She had been underestimated by criminals who saw only her age and disability. She had been doubted by a system that often overlooked the voices of the elderly and vulnerable. But she had taken the stand, she had told her truth, and she had proved them all wrong. That was her gift to the world. That was her enduring message. You are never too old, too disabled, or too vulnerable to make a difference. You just have to decide to try. And Margaret Ellen Brooks, a blind grandmother from a small town who became a national hero, had shown everyone exactly how it was done. Years later, when people asked what made her special, what allowed her to accomplish what she did, the answer was always the same. It wasn't her intelligence, though she was brilliant. It wasn't her connections, though she built a powerful network. It wasn't luck, though timing certainly played a role. It was her refusal to accept that she couldn't, her absolute conviction that truth would prevail, her willingness to stand alone, if necessary, against forces that seemed overwhelming. It was her voice, clear and steady, echoing through a courtroom and across the years. I heard what I heard, I remembered what I remembered, and I spoke the truth. That was all she did, and it changed everything. The final chapter of Margaret Ellen Brooks's story was written not in a courtroom or a legislative chamber, but in the countless small moments that followed her example. It was written by the elderly woman in Nebraska who reported a suspicious financial advisor after reading about Margaret's testimony, preventing the theft of her retirement savings. It was written by the nursing home residents in Florida who organized to demand better treatment after seeing footage of Margaret speaking to Congress, leading to significant reforms in their facility. It was written by the disabled veteran in Oregon who pursued a fraud case against a contractor who had cheated him, inspired by Margaret's words about not letting disability become an excuse for inaction. It was written by the children and grandchildren of elderly people across the country who became more vigilant about protecting their loved ones from exploitation, educated by the awareness campaigns that Margaret's advocacy had sparked. And it was written by Michael, Jennifer, Sophie, and Marcus, who carried her lessons in their hearts every day. Sophie, now a teenager, had started a club at her school to teach students about elder fraud awareness. My great-grandmother always said that knowledge is power, she explained to the local newspaper. If young people understand how these scams work, they can help protect the older people in their lives. Marcus, studying pre-law at university, had written his admissions essay about Margaret. She showed me that the law isn't just about rules and procedures, he wrote. It's about people, about justice, about making sure that everyone's voice is heard, regardless of age or ability or circumstance. Jennifer had become a board member of the National Coalition for Senior Rights, continuing the work that Margaret had begun. She would have wanted us to keep fighting, Jennifer said at her first board meeting. Not to honor her memory, but because it's the right thing to do. And Michael, now the head of the non-profit forensic accounting organization he had founded, devoted his life to helping fraud victims navigate the complex financial and legal systems that often seemed designed to defeat them. My grandmother used to tell me that the system isn't broken, he said in an interview on the 10th anniversary of the Morrison verdict. It's working exactly as it was designed to. The question is, who designed it and who benefits from it? Our job is to make sure the system works for everyone, not just the powerful. In the small cemetery where Margaret and Walter rested, visitors continued to leave tokens of appreciation. Flowers, of course, but also handwritten notes, small stones from the Jewish tradition of honoring the dead, and sometimes, from people who had never met her but had been touched by her story, a simple white cane placed gently against her headstone. One note, left by an anonymous visitor, read, "You taught me that I could fight back. You taught me that my voice matters. I won this week because of you." Another said, "Mrs. Brooks, I'm 82 years old and I start law school next month. It's never too late. You showed me that." A third, from a child's handwriting, said simply, "You are my hero. I want to be brave like you." Margaret would have been embarrassed by the attention. She never wanted to be famous or revered. She just wanted to tell the truth and see justice done. But in telling her truth, she became something more than just a witness or an advocate. She became a symbol, a reminder that courage has no age limit, that the most powerful testimony comes not from experts or professionals, but from ordinary people who have experienced extraordinary injustice and refused to stay silent. That a blind grandmother, mocked by lawyers who should have known better, could take the stand and change the world. The Morrison Development Building, that once housed the company's headquarters, was torn down 5 years after the verdict. In its place, a community center was built, funded in part by the settlement money recovered from Morrison's assets. The center was named the Margaret E. Brooks Community Center, and it served the elderly population of the surrounding area with programs for education, socialization, and support services. On the day it opened, a large crowd gathered for the dedication ceremony. A plaque in the entrance hall bore Margaret's image and her most famous words. Visitors often stopped to read it, running their fingers over the raised letters just as Margaret would have done. "I have been blind for 20 years. In that time I have learned that sight is just one way of perceiving the world. I heard what I heard, I remembered what I remembered, and I spoke the truth. That's all any of us can do." Below the quote, in smaller letters, was a dedication. "To Margaret Ellen Brooks, who saw more clearly than most and taught us all to listen." And at the very bottom, almost hidden, was a small symbol, a white cane crossed with the scales of justice. It wasn't the grandest memorial, it wasn't the most famous, but every day elderly residents walked through those doors and found community, support, and dignity, exactly what Margaret had sought when she first moved to Willow Creek. Exactly what she had spent the last years of her life fighting to ensure for others. The lawyers had mocked her. They had looked at a blind elderly woman and seen someone to be dismissed. They had seen weakness where there was strength, confusion where there was clarity, vulnerability where there was courage. They had been wrong. And now, in a community center built on the ashes of their corruption, the people they had tried to exploit gathered every day to prove just how wrong they had been. That was Margaret Ellen Brooks's final victory, not a judgment or a verdict, but a living testament to the truth she had spoken. A truth that echoed still in courtrooms and community centers, in the hearts of advocates and the memories of those she had helped. A truth that would never be silenced, because Margaret Ellen Brooks had taken the stand. And she had proved them all wrong.